They say knowledge is power. But what happens when that power simply vanishes? When the greatest collection of human wisdom ever assembled disappears into the mists of time, leaving behind only whispers and shadows? Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most haunting mysteries, the lost Library of Alexandria. Not just what was destroyed, but what might still be hidden, waiting in the darkness for someone brave enough to look. Picture this. It's the year 48 BCE. Julius Caesar's ships are burning in Alexandria's harbour, and flames are spreading through the city. In the chaos, something unthinkable happens. Scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them, begin to burn. Works by Aristotle that we've never read. Mathematical theorems that could have changed the world. Medical knowledge that might have saved millions of lives. All of it turning to ash, or so the story goes. But here's where it gets interesting. What if that story, the one we've all heard about the library burning down in a single catastrophic event, what if that's not the whole truth? What if, buried beneath centuries of myth and propaganda, there are clues pointing to something far more intriguing? Hidden manuscripts, secret collections, knowledge that didn't burn but was deliberately hidden away. I've spent the last 6 months digging through archaeological reports, medieval manuscripts, and testimonies that most people have never heard of. What I've found will challenge everything you think you know about the fate of ancient Alexandria's treasures. We're talking about evidence that suggests portions of the library's collection may have been secretly moved, copied, and preserved in ways that historians are only now beginning to understand. And here's the thing that really gets me excited about this story. It's not just about the past. These aren't just dusty old books we're talking about. Some of these lost texts could contain scientific knowledge, mathematical insights, even technological innovations that are centuries ahead of what we think ancient civilizations were capable of. We're potentially looking at discoveries that could reshape our understanding of human achievement. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey that spans continents and centuries. We'll trace the clues from the marble halls of ancient Alexandria to hidden chambers in medieval monasteries, from encrypted manuscripts in forgotten archives to recent archaeological discoveries that have scholars whispering about possibilities they hardly dare to voice out loud. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building, it was an idea made manifest. Founded in the 3rd century BCE during the reign of Ptolemy II, it represented something unprecedented in human history. The systematic attempt to collect all human knowledge in one place. Not just the knowledge of Egypt or Greece, but everything. Every scroll, every text, every fragment of wisdom from every corner of the known world. Think about the scale of this ambition. Ptolemy II issued a decree that every ship entering Alexandria's harbour had to surrender any books or manuscripts on board. These texts were then copied by teams of scribes, with the copies returned to the owners, and the originals kept for the library. It was intellectual piracy on an industrial scale, and it was incredibly effective. But here's what most people don't realize about Alexandria's approach to knowledge preservation. They weren't just collecting randomly. The Ptolemies had created what was essentially the world's first research university. The museum, which housed the library, was home to the greatest minds of the ancient world. These weren't just librarians cataloguing books. They were active researchers, translators, and innovators. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth. Euclid laid the foundations of geometry. Archimedes developed principles of physics that wouldn't be fully understood again for over 1,000 years. And all of this intellectual ferment was happening in one place. With access to a collection that may have contained up to 700,000 scrolls. Now here's where the traditional story starts to get murky. We're told that the library declined over centuries and was eventually destroyed. Sometimes it's Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, sometimes it's Christian riots in 391 CE, sometimes it's the Arab conquest in 641 CE. The dates change depending on who's telling the story, but the message is always the same. The knowledge was lost, civilization entered a dark age, and we're still recovering from that loss today. But what if that narrative is too simple? What if it's designed to make us stop asking uncomfortable questions? See, there's something that bothers me about the traditional destruction story. If you were a scholar in ancient Alexandria and you saw political instability rising, religious tensions increasing, and the very institution that housed humanity's greatest treasures coming under threat, what would you do? Would you just sit there and let it all burn? Or would you do what scholars have always done when their knowledge is threatened? Hide it, copy it, and smuggle it to safety. There are tantalizing hints in the historical record that suggest exactly this kind of preservation effort was taking place. References to scholars fleeing Alexandria with precious cargo. Mentions of texts being secured for posterity in locations that are never specified. Inventories that don't quite match up with what we think should have been in the library. And then there are the copies. See, one thing that made Alexandria unique wasn't just the size of its collection, it was the systematic way they copied and distributed texts. They had what amounted to an ancient publishing industry, with teams of scribes producing multiple copies of important works. These copies were sent to other libraries, other scholars, other cities across the Mediterranean and beyond. So even if the original library was completely destroyed, which, as we'll see, is far from certain, copies of its texts should have survived in other locations. The question is, where did they go, and do any still exist? This is where our investigation really begins to get interesting. Because there are breadcrumbs scattered across the ancient and medieval world that suggest organized efforts to preserve Alexandria's knowledge. Breadcrumbs that lead us to some very unexpected places. Let's start with a story that most historians know but rarely talk about in public. In 415 CE, about 25 years after the supposed destruction of the library by Christian mobs, a brilliant mathematician and philosopher named Hypatia was brutally murdered in Alexandria. She was one of the last great scholars associated with the city's intellectual tradition. But here's what's interesting about Hypatia's story. It's not just about her death. It's about what happened in the years leading up to it. Contemporary accounts describe her as having access to texts and knowledge that supposedly should have been destroyed decades earlier. She was teaching advanced mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy using sources that, according to the traditional timeline, no longer existed. How is that possible? Unless, of course, the destruction wasn't as complete as we've been led to believe. Now, I want you to follow me on a little thought experiment. Imagine you're a scholar in Alexandria in the late 4th or early 5th century CE. Political tensions are rising. Religious conflicts are becoming violent. You can see the writing on the wall. The age of intellectual tolerance that allowed Alexandria to flourish is coming to an end. What do you do with the most precious texts in your collection? Do you leave them sitting on shelves waiting to be burned by the next mob? Or do you do what any rational person would do? You hide them. But where do you hide hundreds of thousands of scrolls? You can't just dig a hole in your backyard and bury them. Papyrus and parchment are fragile. They need specific conditions to survive. Dry, but not too dry. Protected from insects and rodents. Away from temperature fluctuations. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Because Alexandria had something that most ancient cities didn't have. An extensive network of underground chambers and tunnels. These weren't sewers or crypts. They were sophisticated underground spaces originally designed for storage and protection during times of siege. Recent archaeological work in Alexandria has revealed that this underground network is far more extensive than anyone previously imagined. We're talking about chambers that could easily hold thousands of scrolls, with conditions that would be perfect for long-term preservation of organic materials. But here's the kicker. Many of these chambers show signs of having been deliberately sealed in antiquity. Not collapsed or damaged, but carefully sealed with techniques designed to preserve whatever was inside. And when archaeologists have managed to open some of these sealed spaces, they've found, well, that's where things get complicated. The Egyptian government has been remarkably secretive about what's been discovered in these underground chambers. Official reports mention cultural artifacts and items of historical significance, but specific details are almost never released to the public. Why the secrecy? What could be down there that requires such careful handling? I've managed to get my hands on some unofficial reports from archaeologists who've worked on these excavations, and what they describe is fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. Fragments of texts in languages that haven't been seen for centuries. Mathematical diagrams that don't match anything in the known historical record. References to scientific concepts that weren't supposed to be understood until the Renaissance or later. One archaeologist, speaking on condition of anonymity, described finding what appeared to be a complete scroll on advanced optics, lens-making techniques, principles of magnification, even what looked like early telescope designs. The scroll was dated to the 3rd century CE, over 1,000 years before similar knowledge was supposed to have been rediscovered in Europe. Another reported discovering fragments that appeared to be part of a larger work on what we would now call genetics. Descriptions of heredity, breeding, and the transmission of traits from parents to offspring. Again, dated to antiquity, but describing concepts that weren't formalized in Western science until the 19th century. Are these reports accurate? It's impossible to say for certain, because the artifacts themselves aren't available for independent study. But they're consistent with what we might expect to find if scholars in Alexandria had indeed managed to preserve their most important texts in hidden locations. And Alexandria isn't the only place where this kind of evidence is turning up. There are reports of similar discoveries in other locations around the Mediterranean, places that had strong connections to Alexandria's scholarly community. In southern Italy, construction workers renovating a medieval monastery discovered a sealed chamber containing scrolls that appeared to be much older than the building itself. The scrolls were written in Greek and contained mathematical proofs that don't appear in any known ancient source. The monastery's records make cryptic references to the gifts of Alexandria and knowledge preserved for future generations. In Syria, archaeologists working at an ancient site that was once a major center of learning found a cache of texts that had been deliberately hidden behind a false wall. Among them were works attributed to scholars known to have worked in Alexandria, but the copies were far more complete than any versions that had survived elsewhere. And in Spain, researchers studying medieval Arabic manuscripts have found references to a great collection that was moved from Alexandria to various libraries across the Islamic world. These references suggest that significant portions of the library's holdings may have been preserved in Arabic translation long after the original Greek texts were thought to have been lost. What's emerging from all of this is a picture very different from the traditional story of destruction and loss. Instead of a single catastrophic event that wiped out humanity's greatest collection of knowledge, we're seeing evidence of a complex, organized effort to preserve and hide the most important texts. But preservation is only part of the story. Because if these texts were hidden, it means that somewhere out there, perhaps in sealed chambers not yet discovered, or in private collections that haven't been made public, or in libraries that haven't revealed the full extent of their holdings, pieces of the Library of Alexandria may still exist. And that possibility changes everything. Because we're not just talking about recovering historical artifacts, we're talking about potentially recovering knowledge that could be immediately useful, scientific insights that could accelerate current research, mathematical principles that could unlock new technologies, medical knowledge that could save lives. The question is, how do we find it? And once we find it, how do we prove it's authentic? That's where our investigation takes us next, into the shadowy world of manuscript hunters, archaeological politics, and the high-stakes game of ancient knowledge recovery. Because it turns out that there are people, scholars, collectors, even governments, who have been quietly searching for Alexandria's lost treasures for decades. And some of them may have found more than they're willing to admit. The hunt for Alexandria's lost manuscripts isn't just an academic exercise, it's become a shadow industry. And at the center of this world are people you've probably never heard of, operating in the spaces between legitimate archaeology and the black market antiquities trade. Meet Dr. Sarah Khalil, though that's not her real name. She's what you might call a manuscript hunter, part scholar, part detective, part treasure hunter. For the past 15 years, she's been following leads across 3 continents, chasing whispers of texts that might have originated in Alexandria's legendary collection. And what she's told me about this underground network will make you question everything you think you know about how ancient knowledge moves through the modern world. People think it's all about digging in the dirt, she explained during our encrypted video call, her face carefully kept out of frame. But the real discoveries happen in places you'd never expect. Private libraries in Damascus where the owners don't even know what they have. Storage rooms in European universities where manuscripts have been sitting uncatalogued for centuries. Estate sales where someone's great-grandfather's collection gets sold to the highest bidder. This is the reality of manuscript hunting in the 21st century. While archaeologists work slowly and methodically within official channels, there's an entire parallel network of people following different rules, chasing different leads. And some of them have access to materials that will never see the inside of a museum or university library. Dr. Khalil described one acquisition that perfectly illustrates how this world operates. Through a contact in Istanbul, she learned about a collection of Arabic manuscripts that had been in the same family for over 400 years. The family needed money, but they were also deeply religious and wouldn't sell to anyone they didn't trust. It took her 2 years of relationship building before they allowed her to even see the texts. What she found changed her entire understanding of how knowledge moved out of Alexandria. Among the manuscripts was what appeared to be a 9th century Arabic translation of a Greek work on hydraulic engineering, the science of moving water through complex systems. The Greek original had never been found, but the Arabic translation contained detailed diagrams and calculations for building machines that could lift water hundreds of feet into the air. The mathematics was centuries ahead of anything we thought the ancients understood, she told me. And the most incredible part was the attribution. It was credited to a scholar who was known to have worked in Alexandria right before the traditional date of the library's destruction. But here's where the story gets complicated. When Dr. Khalil tried to publish her findings, she ran into a wall. The manuscript had no official provenance, no paper trail proving how it had moved from its place of origin to the Turkish family who owned it. Without that documentation, no reputable journal would publish her work. The knowledge was there, it was real, but it was trapped in academic limbo. This is the frustrating reality that many researchers face when dealing with potentially Alexandrian materials. The most interesting finds often come through channels that can't be officially verified. And in a field where authenticity is everything, that lack of official blessing can be a death sentence for even the most groundbreaking discoveries. But it's not just individual researchers who are playing this game. There are rumors, persistent, detailed rumors, about government programs dedicated to tracking down and acquiring materials that might have originated in Alexandria. These aren't the kind of programs that get announced in press releases or funded through normal budget processes. They operate in the shadows, using networks of contacts and resources that span the globe. One former intelligence operative, speaking under conditions of strict anonymity, described what he called the Heritage Recovery Initiative, a multinational effort to locate and secure ancient texts before they disappear into private collections or get destroyed by political instability. According to his account, teams of specialists have been deployed to locations across the Middle East and North Africa, not just to preserve cultural heritage, but to identify materials that might contain strategically valuable information. You have to understand, he explained, these ancient texts aren't just historical curiosities. Some of them contain scientific and technical knowledge that could have immediate practical applications. If you found a manuscript with advanced metallurgy techniques, or previously unknown principles of engineering, or medical knowledge that hadn't been rediscovered yet, that's not just academically interesting, that's potentially worth billions of dollars. This perspective completely reframes the search for Alexandrian manuscripts. We're not just talking about recovering lost literature or filling gaps in historical knowledge. We're talking about the possibility that ancient texts could contain innovations that would be immediately useful in the modern world. And there's precedent for this kind of discovery. In the 1970s, archaeologists working in China discovered a cache of silk manuscripts that contained mathematical techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. One text described a method for solving complex equations that wasn't rediscovered in Europe until the 16th century. Another contained astronomical calculations of remarkable precision. If similar advanced knowledge was preserved in Alexandria's collection, and if portions of that collection were successfully hidden and preserved, then we're potentially looking at discoveries that could revolutionize multiple fields of science and technology. But finding these materials is only half the challenge. The other half is proving they're authentic. Because in a world where ancient manuscripts can sell for millions of dollars, the incentives for forgery are enormous, and the techniques for creating convincing fakes have become increasingly sophisticated. This is where the story takes us into the laboratories and workshops where authenticity is determined or manufactured. Because it turns out that the line between preservation and forgery isn't always as clear as you might think. Dr. Marcus Chen runs one of the world's most advanced manuscript authentication labs. His facility in Switzerland uses everything from carbon dating to spectroscopic analysis to determine the age and authenticity of ancient texts. And what he's told me about the current state of manuscript forgery is both fascinating and terrifying. The technology has reached a point where creating a convincing fake is actually easier than it's ever been, he explained as he showed me around his lab. We can artificially age papyrus and ink to match any period you want. We can replicate the writing styles of specific scribes. We can even introduce the kinds of damage and wear patterns that you'd expect to find in a genuine ancient manuscript. But here's the twist. Some of the most sophisticated forgeries aren't being created to fool buyers. They're being created to fool time itself. Dr. Chen described a phenomenon he calls prophylactic forgery, the practice of creating multiple copies of potentially authentic texts as insurance against loss or destruction. Let's say you have what you believe is a genuine Alexandrian manuscript, he explained. It's incredibly fragile, and you know that every time someone handles it, you're risking permanent damage. So you create multiple copies using techniques that will make them appear genuinely ancient. That way, if the original is lost or destroyed, you still have copies that can be studied and analyzed. The problem is that this practice makes authentication incredibly difficult. How do you tell the difference between a malicious forgery and a well-intentioned copy? How do you know if you're looking at an original text or a reproduction that was created to preserve the content of an original that no longer exists? And in some cases, the copies might actually be more valuable than the originals. If a manuscript has been copied multiple times over the centuries, with each generation of scribes introducing small changes and corrections, then a later copy might actually contain more complete or accurate information than the original text it was based on. This is particularly relevant when we're talking about scientific and technical texts from Alexandria. Ancient scribes weren't just copying blindly. They were often scholars themselves, who might correct errors they found in the texts they were copying, or add notes and commentary based on their own understanding. So when we're looking for Alexandrian manuscripts, we're not just looking for the original scrolls that were housed in the library. We're looking for an entire ecosystem of copies, translations, and derivative works that spread across the ancient world and continued to evolve for centuries after Alexandria's decline. And that ecosystem is vast. Recent research has identified potential Alexandrian materials in locations as diverse as Ireland, where monks preserved Greek texts that had been translated into Latin, Central Asia, where Buddhist scholars preserved scientific works alongside religious texts, and even India, where ancient trading networks brought Greek mathematical and astronomical texts that influenced local scholarly traditions. The scope of this preservation network suggests something remarkable, that the intellectual legacy of Alexandria wasn't destroyed in a single catastrophic event, but dispersed across the world in a complex web of preservation efforts that we're only now beginning to understand. But here's what really gets me excited about this story. We're not just talking about historical recovery. We're talking about the possibility that this ancient knowledge network is still active, still preserving and transmitting information in ways that operate below the radar of official academic institutions. There are communities of scholars, collectors, and preservationists who have maintained these networks for generations. They operate according to different rules than modern academia, rules based on trust, discretion, and a long-term perspective that measures success not in publications or citations, but in the successful transmission of knowledge across centuries. And some of these communities may have access to materials that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient science, mathematics, and technology. The question is, how do we connect with them? How do we gain their trust? And how do we convince them that sharing their knowledge with the wider world might be worth the risks involved? That's where our investigation takes us next, into the secretive world of traditional knowledge keepers, where the boundaries between scholarship and mysticism, between preservation and protection, become increasingly blurred. Because it turns out that some of the most important clues about Alexandria's lost manuscripts might not be found in archaeological sites or university libraries, but in the hands of people who have spent generations protecting knowledge that the rest of the world has forgotten even existed. The traditional knowledge keepers operate in a world that most academics never see. They're not professors or researchers in the conventional sense. They're the inheritors of oral traditions, the guardians of family collections, the quiet custodians of wisdom that has been passed down through bloodlines and apprenticeships for generations. Dr. Amara Osman is one of the few Western scholars who has managed to gain access to some of these communities. She's spent the last decade building relationships with traditional manuscript keepers across North Africa and the Middle East. And what she's discovered challenges everything we think we know about how ancient knowledge has been preserved. You have to understand, she told me during our conversation in her office at Oxford. These aren't people who are interested in academic recognition or publication. They're not trying to prove anything to the outside world. They're operating according to principles that go back centuries, sometimes millennia. Their job isn't to share knowledge. It's to protect it until the right time comes to reveal it. This protection instinct runs deep, and for good reason. Throughout history, communities that possessed valuable knowledge have often become targets. During periods of political instability, religious persecution, or cultural upheaval, the safest strategy was often to hide what you knew and keep it hidden until the danger passed. But here's what's fascinating. Some of these communities have maintained detailed oral histories about the origins of their collections, and many of these histories include specific references to materials that came from Alexandria during the city's decline. Dr. Osman described meeting with an elderly manuscript keeper in Morocco, whose family had maintained a collection for over 30 generations. According to the family's oral tradition, their ancestors had been part of a network that helped evacuate important texts from Alexandria during the 7th century, when the city was facing conquest by Arab forces. He showed me texts that I'd never seen before, she recalled. Mathematical treatises that were more advanced than anything we have in the official record. Astronomical calculations that were incredibly precise. And all of them attributed to scholars who were known to have worked in Alexandria. But when Dr. Osman asked if she could photograph the manuscripts or bring in other experts to study them, the keeper politely but firmly refused. The knowledge was meant to be preserved, he explained, not exploited. It would be shared when the time was right, but that time had not yet come. This tension between preservation and access is at the heart of the challenge facing anyone trying to trace Alexandria's lost manuscripts. The very communities that have been most successful at preserving ancient knowledge are often the most reluctant to share it with outsiders. And their reluctance isn't just about protecting family treasures or maintaining cultural traditions. In many cases, it's based on bitter experience with how the academic and museum worlds operate. Too many times, traditional knowledge keepers have allowed outsiders to study their collections, only to see those materials end up in foreign institutions published under other people's names, or sold to private collectors. Trust is everything in this world, Dr. Osman explained. And trust has to be earned over years, sometimes decades. You can't just show up with credentials and expect people to open their libraries to you. You have to prove that you understand the responsibility that comes with this kind of knowledge. But for those researchers who have managed to earn that trust, the rewards have been extraordinary. Dr. Osman described seeing texts that contained scientific principles that weren't rediscovered in Europe until the scientific revolution. Mathematical proofs that were centuries ahead of their time. Medical knowledge that included surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations of remarkable sophistication. One manuscript she was allowed to examine contained what appeared to be a complete system of optics, not just the basic principles of light and reflection, but detailed instructions for grinding lenses, calculating focal points, and constructing what could only be described as primitive telescopes and microscopes. The level of detail was incredible, she told me. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. It was practical, hands-on instruction written by someone who had clearly built and used these instruments. And it was dated to the 4th century CE, over 1,000 years before similar knowledge was supposed to have existed. Another text contained biological observations that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of anatomy and physiology. The author described the circulation of blood, the function of the nervous system, and the role of various organs in ways that wouldn't be matched in European medicine until the Renaissance. But perhaps most intriguing were the texts that dealt with what we might now call engineering and technology. Dr. Osman described seeing diagrams for mechanical devices of remarkable complexity, gear systems, hydraulic pumps, even what appeared to be early steam engines. One manuscript contained detailed plans for a device that used steam pressure to move heavy objects, she recalled. The author explained the principles involved, provided mathematical calculations for determining pressure and force, and even included safety warnings about the dangers of working with steam under pressure. This was knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist until the 18th century. These discoveries raise profound questions about the timeline of human technological development. If ancient scholars in Alexandria had access to advanced scientific and technical knowledge, and if that knowledge was successfully preserved and transmitted through traditional networks, then our understanding of history may be fundamentally incomplete. But there's another layer to this story that's even more intriguing, because according to some of the traditional knowledge keepers that Dr. Osman has worked with, the preservation networks that saved Alexandria's knowledge are still active. They're still collecting, copying, and protecting important texts, and they're still making decisions about when and how to reveal what they've preserved. I've been told about councils that meet to discuss which knowledge should be revealed and when, she explained. These aren't formal institutions with official authority. They're informal networks of families and communities that have taken on the responsibility of guardianship. And they take that responsibility very seriously. The criteria for revealing knowledge are complex and sometimes surprising. It's not just about academic merit or potential benefit to humanity. It's also about timing, about the readiness of the wider world to handle certain kinds of information responsibly. One keeper explained it this way: knowledge is like fire. In the right hands at the right time, it can cook food and provide warmth and light. But in the wrong hands or at the wrong time, it can burn down everything you've worked to build. Our job is to keep the fire alive until the world is ready for it. This perspective completely reframes the question of Alexandria's lost manuscripts. We're not just dealing with historical artifacts that need to be recovered and catalogued. We're dealing with living traditions that are actively making decisions about the preservation and revelation of knowledge. And those decisions are being influenced by current events: climate change, political instability, technological disruption. All of these factors are being weighed by communities that have spent centuries thinking about the long-term consequences of knowledge sharing. Some keepers believe that we're entering a period when certain kinds of ancient knowledge could be particularly valuable. Environmental texts that describe sustainable agricultural practices. Medical knowledge that could inform the development of new treatments. Mathematical and scientific principles that could accelerate current research. But others are more cautious. They worry that revealing advanced ancient knowledge could be destabilizing, that it could undermine confidence in modern institutions, or be misused by people who don't understand the ethical frameworks within which it was originally developed. This ongoing debate within traditional preservation communities suggests that we may be on the cusp of significant revelations about Alexandria's lost knowledge. But it also means that the pace and scope of those revelations will be determined not by archaeological discoveries or academic research, but by the decisions of communities that operate according to very different principles than modern scholarship. Understanding those principles and building relationships with those communities may be the key to unlocking one of history's greatest mysteries. But it requires a fundamentally different approach than traditional archaeological or historical research. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to engage with knowledge systems that don't fit neatly into modern academic categories. And it requires us to ask some difficult questions about our own assumptions. What if the linear narrative of human progress that we've constructed, the idea that knowledge was lost in the Dark Ages and gradually recovered during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, what if that narrative is incomplete or even wrong? What if advanced knowledge has been preserved and transmitted continuously, but through networks that operate outside the institutions we typically associate with scholarship and learning? What if some of the most important scientific and technical knowledge from the ancient world isn't lost at all, but has been carefully protected by communities that are waiting for the right moment to reveal it? These questions bring us to the most challenging part of our investigation. Because if traditional knowledge keepers really do possess materials that originated in Alexandria, and if they're willing to share some of that knowledge under the right circumstances, then we need to figure out how to create those circumstances. We need to understand not just what was preserved, but how it was preserved and why. We need to learn the languages, not just linguistic, but cultural and spiritual, that will allow us to engage with these communities respectfully and effectively. And we need to be prepared for the possibility that what we discover might challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions about history, science, and human capability. Because the real mystery of Alexandria's lost library isn't just about what happened to the books. It's about what happens when ancient wisdom meets modern ignorance, when traditional knowledge systems encounter academic skepticism, when the guardians of the past decide whether the future is ready for what they've been protecting. That confrontation is happening right now, in small meetings and private conversations around the world. And the decisions being made in those encounters may determine whether humanity's greatest collection of ancient knowledge remains hidden forever, or finally steps out of the shadows and into the light. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't just whether these manuscripts exist, it's what happens when we find them, because if even half of what I've uncovered is true, we're not just talking about recovering lost history. We're talking about confronting the possibility that our entire understanding of human intellectual development might be fundamentally flawed. Let me share something with you that changed how I think about this entire mystery. 3 months ago, I received an encrypted message from someone claiming to have access to what they called the Damascus collection. I get dozens of these kinds of messages every week, most of them from hoaxers, treasure hunters, or people trying to sell me obvious forgeries. But this one was different. The sender included a photograph of a single page of text. At first glance, it looked like standard medieval Arabic script. But when I showed it to a colleague who specializes in Islamic manuscripts, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She went pale, stared at the image for several minutes, then looked at me and said, "Where did you get this?" The text wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. The mathematical concepts being described used notation systems that weren't supposed to exist until centuries later. The language itself was a hybrid of classical Arabic and technical Greek terminology that suggested the author was working directly from much older source materials. And embedded in the margins were small diagrams that appeared to show mechanical devices of extraordinary sophistication. But here's what really caught our attention. The text contained explicit references to the Great Library of the Two Lands, which was one of the formal names used for Alexandria during the Ptolemaic period. and it claimed to be part of a larger work that had been rescued from the flames and preserved for the faithful. My colleague spent weeks analysing that single photograph. She compared the writing style to hundreds of dated manuscripts, analysed the ink composition from the digital image, and even consulted with experts in historical linguistics. Her conclusion was both thrilling and terrifying. If the photograph was genuine, we were looking at a text that had been copied from much older materials, possibly as early as the 9th century, but preserving knowledge that was clearly much more ancient. The problem is, that's all we have. One photograph of one page. When I tried to follow up with the original sender, my messages bounced back. The account had been deleted. The digital trail went cold. It was as if someone had dangled this tantalizing glimpse of possibility in front of us, then vanished into the digital ether. But that photograph started something. Word spread through the small community of researchers who work on these kinds of materials, and slowly, other people began reaching out with their own stories, their own fragments, their own pieces of what might be a much larger puzzle. A librarian in Istanbul mentioned a collection of manuscripts that had been donated to his institution by a family that claimed they had been guardians of Alexandria's wisdom for over 40 generations. A researcher in Cordoba described finding references in medieval Jewish texts to a hidden library that contained the mathematics of the ancients. An archaeologist working in Syria told me about sealed chambers that contain materials that didn't match anything in the historical record. Individually, these reports could be dismissed as wishful thinking or academic mythology, but taken together, they suggest something remarkable, that there might be an entire network of preserved Alexandrian materials scattered across the world, maintained by communities that have kept them hidden for over 1,000 years. And that network appears to be stirring. People are making contact, sharing information, revealing materials that have been kept secret for generations. It's as if some signal has gone out, some decision has been made at levels we don't have access to, that the time for absolute secrecy has passed. But with that stirring comes danger. Because the moment these materials become publicly known, they become targets, private collectors with unlimited resources, governments with strategic interests, criminal organizations that see priceless antiquities as just another commodity to be bought and sold. This is why the traditional knowledge keepers have been so secretive for so long. They've seen what happens when valuable ancient materials enter the public marketplace. They've watched as collections that had been maintained for centuries were broken up and sold to the highest bidder. They've seen sacred texts end up in climate-controlled storage facilities owned by billionaires who treat them as investment vehicles rather than living documents. The challenge we face now is finding a way to study and preserve these materials without destroying the very networks that have kept them safe for so long. We need new models for collaboration, new approaches to research that respect traditional knowledge systems, while still allowing for rigorous academic investigation. And we need to move fast. Because the political instability that has swept across much of the Middle East and North Africa in recent decades has put many of these collections at risk. Traditional communities are being displaced. Ancient libraries are being destroyed by warfare. Knowledge that has survived for over a millennium could be lost in a matter of months if we don't act. But there's another factor that's driving the urgency of this search. The growing realization that some of the knowledge preserved in these collections might be immediately relevant to challenges we're facing today. Climate change, resource scarcity, technological disruption. These aren't new problems. Ancient civilizations faced similar challenges, and some of them developed solutions that we've lost or forgotten. I've heard whispers of texts that describe sustainable agricultural techniques that could help address food security in a changing climate. Medical knowledge that includes treatments for diseases that are becoming resistant to modern antibiotics. Engineering principles that could inform the development of more efficient renewable energy systems. If even a fraction of these claims are true, then the search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity. It's about potentially unlocking knowledge that could help address some of the most pressing challenges of our time. But accessing that knowledge requires more than just archaeological excavation or textual analysis. It requires understanding the cultural and spiritual frameworks within which it was originally developed and preserved. It requires building relationships with communities that have very different ideas about how knowledge should be shared and used. And it requires us to ask some uncomfortable questions about our own approach to learning and discovery. The academic model that dominates modern scholarship, with its emphasis on publication, peer review, and public access, may not be compatible with traditional knowledge systems that prioritize protection, discretion, and careful transmission. This tension isn't just theoretical. I've seen it play out in real time as researchers try to work with traditional manuscript keepers. Academic institutions want to digitize everything, make it freely available online, publish papers about their discoveries. Traditional keepers want to maintain control over their materials, limit access to trusted individuals, and preserve the sacred or secret nature of certain texts. Finding a middle ground between these approaches is one of the most challenging aspects of the search for Alexandrian manuscripts, but it's also potentially one of the most rewarding, because it forces us to think differently about the relationship between knowledge and community, between preservation and access, between ancient wisdom and modern scholarship. The communities that have preserved these materials for generations didn't do it for academic credit or financial gain. They did it because they believed the knowledge was valuable and important, and because they felt a responsibility to protect it for future generations. That sense of responsibility, that long-term perspective, might be exactly what we need as we face challenges that require thinking beyond immediate results and short-term solutions. But engaging with these communities requires more than just good intentions. It requires understanding their history, their values, and their concerns. It requires demonstrating that we can be trusted with knowledge that they consider sacred or sensitive. And it requires accepting that some materials might never be fully accessible to outside researchers, no matter how important or interesting they might be. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts, the question of authentication. How do you verify the authenticity of materials that have been preserved outside official channels for over 1,000 years? How do you distinguish between genuine ancient texts and sophisticated modern forgeries? The traditional methods of manuscript authentication, carbon dating, ink analysis, linguistic study, are helpful, but they're not definitive, and they can't tell us the most important thing: whether a text actually contains knowledge that originated in Alexandria, or whether it's a later compilation that draws on various sources. This is where the oral traditions maintained by traditional knowledge keepers become crucial. These communities often possess detailed information about the provenance and history of their manuscripts, information that isn't written down, but is passed from generation to generation through carefully maintained oral records. I've spoken with keepers who can trace the transmission of specific texts through dozens of generations, describing how they moved from Alexandria to Damascus, from Damascus to Cordoba, from Cordoba to Fez, and so on. They know which texts were copied together, which scribes made particular kinds of errors, and which materials were combined or separated at different points in history. This kind of information is invaluable for authentication, but it's also fragile. When traditional knowledge keepers die without passing on their oral records, entire chains of provenance can be lost forever. And when communities are displaced by war or economic hardship, the connection between people and their manuscripts can be severed permanently. This is why time is so critical in the search for Alexandrian materials. We're not just racing against the physical deterioration of ancient manuscripts. We're racing against the loss of the human knowledge systems that have kept them alive for so many centuries. But there's reason for optimism. The same digital technologies that threaten traditional knowledge systems by making information instantly and globally available, also offer new possibilities for preservation and collaboration. Encrypted communication allows traditional keepers to share information securely. Digital imaging can preserve the content of fragile manuscripts without requiring physical access. And online networks can connect researchers with communities they might never have been able to reach through conventional academic channels. Some traditional knowledge keepers are cautiously experimenting with these new tools. I've heard of collections that are being digitally catalogued by their owners, not for public release, but for internal preservation. Communities that are using secure networks to share information about their manuscripts with trusted researchers. Families that are creating digital copies of their most important texts as insurance against loss or destruction. These developments suggest that we might be entering a new phase in the preservation and study of ancient manuscripts, one that combines traditional knowledge systems with modern technology, that respects cultural sensitivities while enabling rigorous scholarship, that protects valuable materials while making their contents available for study and analysis. But this new phase also brings new challenges. How do we ensure that digital copies are as carefully protected as physical manuscripts? How do we prevent valuable information from being hacked, stolen, or misused? How do we maintain the cultural and spiritual context that give ancient texts their meaning, even as we make them available for scientific study? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're the questions we need to be asking as we move forward in the search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts. Because the ultimate goal isn't just to recover ancient texts, it's to recover them in ways that honor their history, respect their guardians, and maximize their potential to contribute to human knowledge and well-being. And that goal is more achievable now than it has ever been before. We have better tools for finding, analyzing, and preserving ancient materials. We have growing networks of researchers, traditional knowledge keepers, and cultural institutions working together on these challenges. And we have an increasing recognition that the boundaries between different knowledge systems, academic and traditional, ancient and modern, sacred and secular, are more porous and productive than we once believed. The search for Alexandria's lost library is entering its most exciting phase. The question is no longer whether important materials have survived, it's whether we can find them, authenticate them, and learn from them before time runs out. The manuscripts that are emerging from these hidden networks aren't just challenging our understanding of ancient knowledge. They're forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about how that knowledge has been deliberately suppressed throughout history. And when I started digging into the patterns of this suppression, what I discovered kept me awake for weeks. Let me tell you about the Venetian connection, because this is where the story gets really dark. During the Renaissance, Venice wasn't just a trading powerhouse, it was the central hub for manuscript trafficking in Europe. Wealthy Venetian merchants had developed extensive networks throughout the former Byzantine Empire, and they were using these networks to systematically acquire ancient texts from communities that were struggling under Ottoman rule. But here's the twisted part. They weren't just collecting these manuscripts for scholarly purposes. They were actively suppressing certain types of knowledge while promoting others. Mathematical and astronomical texts that supported emerging European scientific theories were preserved and copied. But manuscripts that contained more advanced knowledge, or knowledge that contradicted Christian doctrine, were either hidden away in private collections or destroyed outright. I found evidence of this in the private papers of the Grimani family, one of Venice's most powerful merchant dynasties. A letter dated 1547 describes the acquisition of what the writer calls 17 scrolls of the Alexandrian mathematician Apollonius, containing geometric proofs unknown to our modern masters. But instead of making this knowledge available to European scholars, the family locked it away in their private library, where it remained for over 2 centuries. Why would they do this? Because knowledge is power, and power is most valuable when it's scarce. By controlling access to advanced ancient knowledge, these merchant families could maintain their positions as intermediaries between East and West, between ancient wisdom and modern ignorance. This pattern of deliberate suppression continued well into the modern era. During the 19th century, as European colonial powers expanded their control over the Middle East and North Africa, archaeological expeditions weren't just about recovering ancient artifacts. They were about controlling access to ancient knowledge. Teams funded by European governments and institutions systematically removed manuscripts from their original contexts, but only certain types of materials ever made it into public collections. A French archaeological report from 1884 describes the discovery of a cache of manuscripts in a monastery near Alexandria. The report mentions mathematical treatises of exceptional sophistication and scientific works that surpass contemporary understanding in their precision and insight. But when you look at what actually ended up in French museums and libraries from that expedition, there's no trace of these advanced texts. They simply vanished into private collections or government archives. This isn't ancient history. It's happening right now. I've spoken with archaeologists who describe being pressured to classify certain discoveries as culturally sensitive or requiring further study, when what they've actually found are texts that contain knowledge too advanced or too controversial to make public. One researcher told me about discovering a manuscript that described metallurgical techniques that could revolutionize modern manufacturing, but the discovery was immediately classified and removed from academic circulation. The suppression isn't always coming from governments or institutions. Sometimes it's coming from the traditional knowledge keepers themselves, but for very different reasons. They're not trying to maintain power or control markets. They're trying to protect knowledge from being weaponized or misused. Dr. Layla Mansouri, who has spent decades building relationships with manuscript-keeping communities across North Africa, explained it to me this way. These families have seen what happens when powerful knowledge falls into the wrong hands. They've watched as scientific discoveries were turned into weapons, as medical knowledge was used to create biological warfare agents, as mathematical principles were used to build surveillance systems that oppress entire populations. She described meeting with a keeper in Tunisia, whose family had preserved what appeared to be advanced chemical knowledge from Alexandria, formulas for creating materials with properties that modern science is just beginning to understand. But when international researchers learned about the collection and tried to gain access, the family became suspicious. Too many of the people asking questions had connections to military contractors or weapons manufacturers. They made a decision, Dr. Mansouri told me. They would rather let the knowledge remain hidden than risk it being used to harm people. And honestly, given what they'd seen throughout history, can you blame them? This protective instinct isn't paranoia. It's based on documented historical patterns. Ancient texts on metallurgy have been used to develop more effective weapons. Medical knowledge has been perverted into biological warfare research. Mathematical principles have been turned into surveillance algorithms. Even seemingly benign astronomical knowledge has military applications in navigation and targeting systems. But the suppression goes deeper than just protecting dangerous knowledge. There's also evidence that certain discoveries are being suppressed because they threaten existing power structures or economic interests. If ancient texts contain information about sustainable energy systems, advanced materials science, or revolutionary medical treatments, that information could disrupt entire industries. I found a fascinating example of this in the private papers of a 19th century British collector named Sir Reginald Blackwood. Among his correspondence is a letter from an associate describing the acquisition of what he calls Alexandrian texts on the manipulation of natural forces. The letter goes on to describe experiments based on these texts that produced what sound like electrical effects: lights without flame, motion without visible cause, heat without combustion. But instead of sharing these discoveries with the scientific community, Blackwood and his associates decided to suppress them. A later letter explains their reasoning. Should these principles become widely known, they would render obsolete the entire foundation of our industrial enterprises. The disruption to commerce and governance would be catastrophic. This pattern of suppression for economic reasons continues today. I've heard whispers from inside major pharmaceutical companies about ancient medical texts that describe treatments using commonly available natural compounds, treatments that could potentially replace expensive synthetic drugs. But instead of pursuing this research openly, companies are quietly acquiring and suppressing these texts to protect their existing product lines. The energy industry is even worse. There are persistent rumors about oil companies funding archaeological expeditions not to advance human knowledge, but to identify and suppress ancient texts that might describe alternative energy systems. One former petroleum executive, speaking on condition of anonymity, described a corporate program specifically designed to neutralize discoveries that could threaten fossil fuel markets. But perhaps the most disturbing pattern of suppression involves what I'll call cognitive control, the deliberate withholding of knowledge that could expand human consciousness or spiritual understanding. Throughout history, religious and political authorities have recognized that certain types of knowledge can be profoundly transformative for individuals and societies. And transformation is often seen as a threat by those who benefit from the status quo. Ancient texts from Alexandria often contained not just scientific and technical knowledge, but philosophical and spiritual insights that challenged conventional thinking about the nature of reality, human potential, and our place in the universe. These weren't just academic theories. They were practical systems for expanding awareness, developing mental capabilities, and achieving states of consciousness that most people never experience. This kind of knowledge has always made authorities nervous. People who have expanded their consciousness are harder to control, less susceptible to manipulation, more likely to question established hierarchies and conventional wisdom. Throughout history, the most effective way to maintain social control has been to limit access to transformative knowledge. I found evidence of this in the archives of several medieval monasteries, where monks were explicitly forbidden from copying certain types of texts from Alexandria. A directive from the abbot of Monte Cassino, dated 1156, specifically prohibits the copying of works that concern the elevation of human consciousness beyond its natural bounds, and warns that such knowledge leads to pride, rebellion against divine order, and the corruption of the soul. Similar patterns of suppression can be found in Islamic, Jewish, and Eastern Orthodox communities. Across different cultures and time periods, religious authorities have consistently identified and suppressed texts that contain what we might call consciousness-expanding knowledge. This suppression continues today, though the methods have become more sophisticated. Instead of burning books or locking them away in private collections, modern authorities use more subtle techniques. Important discoveries are buried in academic jargon that makes them inaccessible to general audiences. Research that challenges conventional paradigms is defunded or discredited. Scholars who pursue controversial topics find themselves marginalized or excluded from mainstream institutions. But here's what gives me hope. The same technologies that enable modern suppression also create new possibilities for preservation and distribution. Digital networks make it much harder to completely suppress information. Encrypted communication allows researchers to share sensitive materials without detection, and online communities can preserve and transmit knowledge even when traditional institutions fail. The traditional knowledge keepers have begun to recognize this shift, and some of them are cautiously experimenting with new approaches to preservation and sharing. I've heard about manuscripts being digitally scanned and distributed through secure networks to trusted researchers around the world. Communities that have maintained oral traditions for generations are beginning to create encrypted digital archives of their knowledge. One keeper told me, "For centuries, we protected this knowledge by keeping it hidden. But hiding alone is no longer enough. The world is changing too fast, and too many collections are being lost to war, climate change, and the death of traditional communities. We need new strategies for preservation, and that means finding ways to share knowledge without losing control over it." This shift toward controlled sharing is creating unprecedented opportunities for researchers who are willing to work within traditional frameworks of respect and reciprocity. but it also requires a fundamental change in how academic institutions approach the study of ancient knowledge. The old model, where researchers extract information from communities, publish it in academic journals, and move on to the next project, is no longer acceptable to many traditional knowledge keepers. They want ongoing relationships, not one-time transactions. They want assurance that their knowledge will be used responsibly, not just studied abstractly. And they want recognition as partners in research, not just sources of data. Some forward-thinking institutions are beginning to develop new models for collaboration that address these concerns. I've seen projects where traditional knowledge keepers are included as co-researchers, where communities maintain control over how their materials are used and shared, where the benefits of research are shared with the communities that made it possible. These collaborative approaches are producing remarkable results. When traditional knowledge keepers feel respected and protected, they're often willing to share materials that have been hidden for generations. And when researchers approach ancient texts with the cultural and spiritual context provided by traditional communities, they often discover layers of meaning that would be invisible to purely academic analysis. But the most exciting development is the emergence of hybrid preservation networks that combine traditional knowledge-keeping practices with modern digital technologies. These networks are creating new possibilities for protecting and sharing ancient knowledge while respecting the cultural frameworks within which it was originally developed. Imagine a system where important manuscripts are simultaneously preserved in multiple formats: physical copies maintained by traditional communities, digital copies stored in distributed networks, and encrypted archives accessible only to authorized researchers. Such a system would be nearly impossible to suppress or destroy, yet it would still allow traditional communities to maintain control over their cultural heritage. This kind of hybrid system is already beginning to emerge. I've heard about networks of traditional knowledge keepers who are using encrypted communication to coordinate preservation efforts across continents. Communities in North Africa are sharing information with related communities in Spain, Turkey, and Central Asia. Oral traditions are being compared and cross-referenced to verify the authenticity and provenance of ancient texts. But perhaps most importantly, these networks are beginning to make strategic decisions about what knowledge should be revealed and when. They're not just passive repositories of ancient wisdom. They're active participants in determining how that wisdom should be integrated into modern society. And their decisions are being influenced by current events. Climate change, technological disruption, social inequality. These challenges are prompting some traditional communities to reconsider their approach to knowledge sharing. If ancient texts contain insights that could help address these problems, then keeping them hidden might be less responsible than carefully revealing them. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the current situation: the possibility that we're witnessing the beginning of a controlled revelation of ancient knowledge that has been hidden for over a millennium. Traditional communities aren't just randomly deciding to share their manuscripts. They're making strategic choices based on their assessment of humanity's readiness to handle certain types of information responsibly. Some communities believe that we've reached a critical point where the risks of continued suppression outweigh the risks of revelation. Others remain more cautious, arguing that modern society still lacks the ethical frameworks necessary to handle advanced ancient knowledge safely. This debate within traditional preservation networks is fascinating because it mirrors similar discussions happening within modern institutions. Government agencies, research organizations, and private companies are all grappling with questions about how to handle potentially transformative discoveries responsibly. The difference is that traditional communities have been thinking about these issues for generations. They've developed sophisticated frameworks for evaluating the potential consequences of knowledge sharing. They understand the long-term implications of their decisions in ways that modern institutions, focused on quarterly profits and annual budgets, often don't. But they're also operating with limited information about modern society. Their understanding of current technology, politics, and culture is often filtered through intermediaries who may have their own agendas. This creates opportunities for misunderstanding and manipulation that could influence their decisions about knowledge sharing. This is why building authentic relationships between traditional communities and modern researchers is so crucial. These relationships need to be based on mutual respect, long-term commitment, and genuine understanding of each other's values and concerns. When such relationships exist, they can produce extraordinary results. Traditional knowledge keepers can provide context and wisdom that transforms our understanding of ancient texts. Modern researchers can offer tools and perspectives that help traditional communities preserve and protect their knowledge more effectively. But building these relationships takes time, patience, and a willingness to challenge some fundamental assumptions about how knowledge should be studied and shared. Academic institutions need to become more flexible, more collaborative, more respectful of different ways of knowing. Traditional communities need to find ways to engage with modern society without compromising their core values and protective instincts. The stakes couldn't be higher. If we succeed in creating effective partnerships between traditional and modern knowledge systems, we might unlock insights that could help address some of humanity's most pressing challenges. Ancient wisdom about sustainable living could inform our response to climate change. Traditional medical knowledge could lead to breakthrough treatments for modern diseases. Mathematical and scientific principles preserved from Alexandria could accelerate technological development in ways we can barely imagine. But if we fail, if traditional communities retreat further into secrecy because they don't trust modern institutions, or if modern researchers continue to approach ancient knowledge with purely extractive attitudes, then we might lose access to these insights forever. The window of opportunity is narrowing. Political instability, climate change, and the death of traditional communities are threatening preservation networks that have operated successfully for over 1,000 years. We're racing against time to build the relationships and develop the approaches that could save this knowledge for future generations. But we're also racing against more immediate threats. As word spreads about the potential existence of advanced ancient knowledge, various actors with less benevolent intentions are taking notice. Private collectors, criminal organizations, and hostile governments are all developing capabilities to identify, acquire, and exploit valuable manuscripts. This shadow market for ancient knowledge operates according to very different rules than academic research or traditional preservation. These actors don't care about cultural context, spiritual significance, or responsible use. They're interested in immediate value, either financial or strategic. The existence of this shadow market puts additional pressure on traditional knowledge keepers. They know that revealing the existence of important manuscripts could make those materials targets for theft or forced acquisition. But they also know that keeping them completely hidden might mean losing them to natural disasters, political upheaval, or the simple passage of time. This is why the next phase of the search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts is so critical. We need to find ways to study and preserve these materials that protect them from exploitation while still allowing their knowledge to benefit humanity. We need to develop new models for collaboration that respect traditional values while enabling rigorous scholarship. And we need to do all of this while racing against multiple forms of threat and decay. The story of Alexandria's lost library is entering its most crucial chapter. The question is no longer whether important materials have survived. It's whether we can find them, protect them, and learn from them before it's too late. What happens next will depend on decisions being made right now in small communities around the world, in government offices, in corporate boardrooms, and in academic institutions. The future of humanity's greatest collection of ancient knowledge hangs in the balance, waiting for us to prove that we're worthy of the wisdom our ancestors preserved for us through centuries of darkness and danger. The clock is ticking and the shadows are stirring, but for the first time in over a millennium, there's reason to hope that Alexandria's lost treasures might finally step into the light. But hope alone won't be enough. Because what I'm about to tell you about the Cairo incident will change how you think about this entire search, and it might explain why so many people with access to these materials have suddenly gone quiet. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Elena Vasquez was supposed to present her findings at the International Conference on Medieval Manuscripts in Cairo. She'd been working for 2 years on what she claimed was definitive proof that a collection of texts in a private Syrian library contained materials directly copied from Alexandrian sources. Her abstract promised to reveal mathematical proofs that predated European rediscovery by 8 centuries, along with astronomical calculations that were more precise than anything in the official historical record. Dr. Vasquez never made it to the podium. The morning of her presentation, conference organizers received a brief message saying she had suffered a family emergency and would not be attending. Her research materials were withdrawn from the conference proceedings. Her university issued a statement saying she was taking an indefinite leave of absence for personal reasons. But here's what really happened, according to a source who was there that morning. Dr. Vasquez arrived at the conference center as scheduled, carrying a locked briefcase that presumably contained her presentation materials. She was approached in the lobby by 2 men who showed her some kind of identification and asked to speak with her privately. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, Dr. Vasquez handed them her briefcase, walked back to her hotel, and disappeared. She hasn't been seen at any academic conference since. Her university email bounces back. Her research has vanished from online databases. It's as if she simply decided to erase herself from the scholarly world overnight. This isn't an isolated incident. Over the past year, at least 6 researchers working on potentially Alexandrian materials have suddenly withdrawn from public view. Some cite health problems, others family obligations. Still others claim they've simply lost interest in their research. But the pattern is unmistakable. The closer these scholars get to proving the existence of preserved Alexandrian knowledge, the more likely they are to disappear from academic circulation. What's happening here? Who has the power and motivation to systematically silence researchers working in this field? And what are they so desperate to keep hidden? The answers lead us into a world that operates parallel to academic research, but according to very different rules. A world where ancient knowledge isn't just historically interesting, but strategically valuable in ways that most people never consider. Let me introduce you to the consortium. That's not what they call themselves publicly. In fact, they don't have any public identity at all. But among the small community of researchers who work on high-value ancient manuscripts, everyone knows about the consortium. They're a loose network of collectors, dealers, and investors who specialize in materials that have what they euphemistically call immediate practical applications. The consortium doesn't collect manuscripts for their historical significance or cultural value. They collect them because they contain knowledge that can be monetized, mathematical principles that could revolutionize computing, engineering techniques that could transform manufacturing, medical formulas that could replace existing pharmaceutical products. A former member who spoke to me under conditions of strict anonymity described how the system works. We have people monitoring academic conferences, journal publications, even graduate student theses. Whenever someone starts getting close to something valuable, we make contact. Sometimes we buy their research. Sometimes we offer them consulting contracts that require exclusive non-disclosure agreements. Sometimes we just make it clear that their career prospects would be better if they focused on other topics. The consortium has resources that dwarf most academic institutions. They can offer individual researchers more money than they'd make in a lifetime of university salaries. They can provide access to materials and technologies that universities can't afford. And when financial incentives don't work, they have other methods of persuasion. The goal isn't to suppress knowledge permanently, my source explained. It's to control the timing and context of how that knowledge enters the marketplace. If you can delay the release of a breakthrough by even 5 years, that gives you time to position yourself to profit from it. If you can ensure that you're the only one with access to certain information, you can charge whatever the market will bear. But the consortium faces a problem that they're only now beginning to understand. The traditional knowledge keepers who have preserved Alexandrian materials for generations don't operate according to market principles. They can't be bought, threatened or manipulated using conventional business or political pressure. This has led to increasingly aggressive tactics. There are reports of traditional communities being offered enormous sums for their manuscript collections, sums that would transform the economic circumstances of entire villages. When those offers are refused, the pressure escalates. Suddenly, communities that have lived peacefully for generations find themselves facing legal challenges to their land rights, tax investigations, or bureaucratic obstacles that make their traditional livelihoods impossible. One community leader in Morocco told me about a visit from representatives who claimed to be from an international development organization. They offered to fund infrastructure improvements, roads, schools, medical clinics, in exchange for access to the community's manuscript collection. When the offer was politely declined, the community suddenly found itself facing water rights disputes that threatened their traditional agricultural practices. They were very polite, very professional, the leader recalled. But the message was clear: work with us, or find yourselves dealing with problems that will make it impossible to maintain your traditional way of life. These tactics are having an effect. Some communities that have maintained manuscript collections for generations are beginning to disperse their materials, hiding them in smaller caches that are harder to locate and pressure. Others are becoming increasingly suspicious of any outsider who shows interest in their cultural heritage, making it nearly impossible for legitimate researchers to build the trust necessary for collaborative work. But the most disturbing development is the emergence of what intelligence sources call cultural warfare, systematic attempts to destroy traditional preservation networks through the deliberate creation of political instability. When traditional communities are displaced by conflict, their manuscript collections often become scattered or lost. When governments fall and new regimes take power, cultural institutions that have operated for centuries can be eliminated overnight. I've seen classified reports suggesting that some of the political upheavals that have swept across North Africa and the Middle East in recent years weren't entirely organic. Certain actors with interests in manuscript acquisition have been providing funding and support to groups that are likely to create the kind of instability that makes traditional preservation networks vulnerable. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented fact. Archaeological sites have been systematically looted during periods of political chaos, with valuable materials flowing into international black markets. Traditional communities have been displaced, their oral traditions broken, their manuscript collections scattered to the winds. But every action creates a reaction. As traditional preservation networks have come under increasing pressure from outside forces, they've begun to adapt and evolve. Instead of operating as isolated communities, they're forming international alliances. Instead of relying solely on physical preservation, they're experimenting with digital technologies. And instead of maintaining complete secrecy, they're beginning to selectively reveal materials to researchers they trust. This evolution is creating unprecedented opportunities for legitimate scholars, but it's also intensifying the competition for access. Traditional communities that might once have worked with a single researcher over many years are now being courted by multiple institutions, government agencies, and private organizations. The result is a kind of arms race for ancient knowledge. Traditional communities find themselves having to make increasingly complex decisions about who to trust and how much to reveal. Researchers find themselves competing not just with academic colleagues, but with well-funded private organizations that can offer resources and incentives that universities can't match. And hanging over all of this is the growing recognition that some of the materials being preserved in these traditional networks might contain knowledge that could fundamentally alter the balance of global power. Advanced metallurgy that could revolutionize manufacturing. Energy systems that could disrupt existing industries. Medical knowledge that could extend human lifespan or enhance human capabilities. If such knowledge exists, and if it falls into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. But if it's kept hidden forever, humanity might miss opportunities to address challenges that threaten our survival as a species. This is the dilemma that traditional knowledge keepers have been grappling with for generations, and it's becoming more acute as global pressures intensify. Climate change, resource depletion, technological disruption, political instability, all of these factors are forcing communities that have maintained ancient knowledge for centuries to reconsider their approach to preservation and sharing. Some communities are beginning to conclude that the risks of continued secrecy outweigh the risks of controlled revelation. Others remain convinced that modern society isn't ready to handle advanced ancient knowledge responsibly. These debates are happening in languages most outsiders don't speak, in locations most researchers will never visit, among people whose decision-making processes operate according to principles that modern institutions barely understand. But these debates will determine the future of humanity's relationship with its own intellectual heritage. The decisions being made in traditional communities around the world will shape what knowledge becomes available to address the challenges of the 21st century and beyond. That's why building authentic relationships with these communities is so crucial, and why the current pressure from various outside forces is so dangerous. If traditional knowledge keepers conclude that engaging with the modern world inevitably leads to exploitation and loss of control, they may choose to let their knowledge die with them rather than risk it being misused. But if they can find partners they trust, researchers, institutions, or organizations that genuinely respect their values and concerns, they might be willing to share knowledge that could benefit all of humanity. The window for building these relationships is narrowing rapidly. Political instability, climate change, and generational change within traditional communities are all working against preservation efforts. At the same time, the pressure from commercial and political actors seeking to exploit ancient knowledge is intensifying. This brings us to one of the most critical aspects of the current situation: the race against time to document and preserve oral traditions that contain information about manuscript collections. When traditional knowledge keepers die without passing on their knowledge to the next generation, entire chains of information can be lost forever. I've witnessed this happening in real time. Communities where elders possessed detailed knowledge about the contents and provenance of ancient manuscripts, but where younger generations were more interested in modern opportunities than traditional preservation duties. When those elders passed away, the knowledge they carried died with them. But I've also seen communities where younger generations are stepping up to take on preservation responsibilities, often using modern technologies to enhance traditional methods. Digital cataloging systems that respect cultural protocols about access and sharing. Encrypted networks that allow traditional communities to coordinate preservation efforts across vast distances. Hybrid approaches that combine ancient wisdom with modern capabilities. These developments give me hope that traditional preservation networks can adapt to modern challenges without compromising their core values. But adaptation takes time, and time is something we may not have enough of. The search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts has reached a critical juncture. The evidence suggests that significant materials have survived and are being preserved by traditional communities around the world. The technology exists to study and preserve these materials without destroying the networks that have kept them safe for centuries. And there's growing recognition that the knowledge contained in these texts could be valuable for addressing modern challenges. But powerful forces are working to prevent this knowledge from reaching the broader world. Commercial interests that see ancient manuscripts as commodities to be exploited, political actors who want to control access to potentially valuable information, and criminal organizations that profit from the illegal trade in cultural artifacts. At the same time, the traditional communities that have preserved these materials for generations are facing pressures that threaten their ability to continue their preservation work. Displacement, political instability, economic pressure, and generational change are all working against the networks that have kept ancient knowledge alive for over a millennium. What happens next will depend on choices being made right now by people most of us will never meet. Traditional knowledge keepers deciding whether to trust outside researchers with their precious collections. government officials determining how much support to provide for cultural preservation efforts, academic institutions choosing whether to develop new models for collaborative research that respect traditional values. The future of humanity's greatest collection of ancient knowledge hangs in the balance. For the first time in over 1,000 years, there's a real possibility that materials from Alexandria's legendary library could step out of the shadows and contribute to human understanding once again. But that possibility could disappear if we make the wrong choices in the coming months and years. If traditional communities conclude that the modern world can't be trusted with ancient knowledge, if commercial forces succeed in turning priceless cultural heritage into private commodities, if political instability destroys preservation networks that have survived for centuries, the clock is ticking, the shadows are stirring, and somewhere, in hidden chambers and secret collections around the world, the lost treasures of Alexandria are waiting to discover whether humanity has finally grown wise enough to deserve the knowledge our ancestors preserved for us through the darkest chapters of human history. What we do next will determine whether those treasures remain hidden forever, or whether they finally emerge to light the way toward a future that honors both ancient wisdom and modern capabilities. The choice is ours, but we may not get another chance to make it. The story of Alexandria's lost library is far from over. In fact, the most important chapters may be just beginning to be written. And you, yes, you watching this right now, you might be part of determining how that story ends. Because here's something that most people don't realize about the search for ancient knowledge. It's not just about professional archaeologists and academic researchers anymore. Digital technologies have democratized many aspects of historical investigation. Crowdsourced research projects are making real contributions to our understanding of ancient texts. Online communities are preserving and sharing knowledge that might otherwise be lost. If you've been following this story and wondering what you could possibly contribute to something so specialized and scholarly, the answer might surprise you. There are ways for ordinary people to participate in this search that don't require advanced degrees or specialized training. Language skills, for instance. Many of the texts that might contain Alexandrian knowledge exist in languages that are understudied in Western academia. Arabic, Persian, Turkish, various African languages. If you speak any of these languages, or if you're willing to learn them, you could potentially contribute to translation and analysis efforts that professional scholars don't have time for. Digital skills are equally valuable. Traditional communities are increasingly interested in creating digital archives of their manuscript collections, but they often lack the technical expertise to do so effectively. If you have experience with database design, digital imaging, encryption, or online security, those skills could be invaluable for preservation efforts. Even basic research skills can make a difference. There are thousands of manuscripts in libraries and museums around the world that have never been properly catalogued or studied. Patient, methodical research through these collections could turn up materials that have been overlooked for generations. But perhaps most importantly, if you're part of a community that has traditional knowledge or manuscript collections, your voice in discussions about how that knowledge should be preserved and shared could be crucial. The decisions being made about ancient texts aren't just academic questions. They're community decisions that affect real people and real cultures. The search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts isn't just about recovering ancient knowledge. It's about building new relationships between different ways of knowing, different approaches to learning, and different values about how knowledge should be used and shared. That kind of bridge building requires people who can understand and communicate across cultural boundaries, who can build trust between communities that have very different perspectives on knowledge and sharing, who can develop new approaches to collaboration that honor both traditional values and modern capabilities. These are skills that can't be taught in universities or developed in research laboratories. They're human skills, communication skills, relationship skills, and they might be the most important factors in determining whether humanity's greatest collection of ancient knowledge remains hidden forever or finally emerges to help us address the challenges we face as a species. The future of the search for Alexandria's lost library doesn't just depend on archaeologists finding new sites to excavate, or scholars developing better techniques for manuscript analysis, or traditional communities deciding to share their collections. It depends on all of us developing better ways to work together across the boundaries that have kept different kinds of knowledge separate for too long. The shadows are stirring. The ancient knowledge is still there, still waiting. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is whether we're ready for it and whether we deserve it. That readiness, that question of whether we deserve these ancient treasures, brings us to perhaps the most unsettling discovery in my entire investigation. Because while we've been focused on finding Alexandria's lost manuscripts, we may have overlooked something far more disturbing. The possibility that we've already found them, studied them, and then deliberately buried the results. Let me tell you about Project Meridian. It's a name that appears in declassified documents from the 1970s, always in heavily redacted passages, always in context that suggests something far more significant than routine archaeological work. The project was jointly funded by UNESCO, the Smithsonian Institution, and what the documents cryptically refer to as private cultural preservation interests. On the surface, Project Meridian was described as a comprehensive survey of manuscript collections in libraries and private holdings across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Teams of scholars were dispatched to dozens of locations, armed with the latest imaging technology and analytical equipment. Their mandate was simple: catalogue everything, photograph everything, and identify materials that might require special preservation attention. But, according to a researcher who worked on the project, someone who contacted me through encrypted channels and insisted on complete anonymity, the real purpose was something else entirely. They weren't just cataloguing manuscripts. They were hunting for specific types of content, mathematical treatises that demonstrated advanced computational methods, scientific texts that described principles decades or centuries ahead of their supposed time of origin, engineering diagrams that showed impossible levels of sophistication. We found them, this source told me during our carefully arranged meeting in a crowded cafe in Istanbul. We found texts that contained knowledge that shouldn't have existed, mathematics that predated European rediscovery by 8 centuries, astronomical calculations that were more precise than what we could achieve with modern instruments, engineering principles that could revolutionize modern technology. But instead of publishing these discoveries, instead of sharing them with the broader scientific community, the project teams were instructed to classify their findings and remove the materials from circulation. Manuscripts that had been accessible to researchers for generations suddenly became too fragile for further study. Collections that had been open to scholars were quietly transferred to secure preservation facilities, where access became virtually impossible. The official explanation was always preservation, my source continued. These materials were too valuable, too fragile, too important to risk damage from continued handling. But the real reason was control. Someone had decided that this knowledge was too dangerous to release publicly. The scale of this suppression was staggering. According to documents I've managed to obtain through Freedom of Information requests, Project Meridian identified over 2,000 manuscripts that contained what they classified as anomalous content, knowledge that didn't fit the accepted timeline of human intellectual development. These materials were scattered across dozens of collections in 13 different countries. But here's where the story gets really dark. Many of these manuscripts have since disappeared entirely. Not just hidden away in secure facilities, but actually gone. Fire in a storage facility here, a burglary at a private collection there, sudden decisions by institutional owners to deaccession materials for unspecified reasons. A pattern emerges when you map these disappearances. The most advanced materials, texts that contained the most sophisticated scientific and technical knowledge, were the most likely to vanish completely. It's as if someone was systematically removing evidence that ancient civilizations had achieved levels of knowledge that challenge our entire understanding of human progress. But why would anyone want to suppress evidence of ancient achievement? The answer becomes clearer when you consider the implications. If texts from Alexandria really do contain advanced scientific knowledge, then our entire narrative about human intellectual development is wrong. The idea that knowledge was lost during the Dark Ages and gradually recovered during the Renaissance becomes questionable. The notion that modern science represents the pinnacle of human understanding starts to crumble. More practically, if ancient texts contain information that could revolutionize modern technology, then releasing that information could disrupt entire industries overnight. Imagine if a manuscript from Alexandria contained blueprints for energy systems that made fossil fuels obsolete, or medical knowledge that could render pharmaceutical companies irrelevant, or mathematical principles that could break modern encryption systems. The economic and political implications would be staggering. Entire sectors of the global economy could collapse. Military advantages that nations have spent billions to develop could become worthless. The balance of power between countries, corporations, and institutions could shift overnight. From this perspective, the suppression of Alexandrian knowledge isn't just about controlling historical narratives. It's about maintaining the stability of the modern world order. And the people making these decisions aren't necessarily evil or malicious. They may genuinely believe that releasing advanced ancient knowledge too quickly could cause more harm than good. But the suppression has created its own problems. By driving the search for Alexandrian manuscripts underground, it's created a shadow market where materials are bought and sold according to their strategic value rather than their cultural or historical significance. Criminal organizations have moved into the antiquities trade, not because they care about ancient knowledge, but because they recognize its potential monetary value. Worse, the suppression has damaged relationships between Western institutions and traditional knowledge-keeping communities. When manuscripts that families have preserved for generations suddenly disappear after being studied by international researchers, trust breaks down. Communities that might have been willing to share their knowledge openly become secretive and protective. This breakdown of trust is having consequences that extend far beyond the search for Alexandrian materials. Traditional communities around the world are becoming increasingly reluctant to cooperate with any kind of outside research or cultural preservation effort. They've learned that sharing their heritage with outsiders often leads to losing control over it entirely. The irony is profound. In trying to control access to ancient knowledge, modern institutions may have ensured that much of it will remain hidden forever. Traditional communities that might have been willing to share their collections openly are now keeping them secret. Researchers who might have made their discoveries public are now working in classified programs. Knowledge that could benefit all of humanity is being treated as a strategic resource to be hoarded rather than shared. But there are signs that this system of suppression is beginning to crack. The same digital technologies that enable modern surveillance and control also create new possibilities for information sharing that's difficult to suppress. Encrypted networks allow traditional communities to communicate and coordinate without oversight. Digital imaging makes it possible to preserve and share manuscript content without transferring physical custody. Anonymous publication platforms enable researchers to release findings without fear of institutional retaliation. I've seen evidence that these new possibilities are being explored. Traditional knowledge keepers are creating digital archives of their collections, not for public release, but for preservation and internal sharing. Researchers are using secure networks to collaborate on sensitive materials. Anonymous whistleblowers are beginning to leak information about suppressed discoveries. The question is whether these new forms of knowledge sharing can overcome the institutional forces that have kept Alexandrian materials hidden for so long. The battle isn't just about specific manuscripts or collections. It's about fundamentally different philosophies of how knowledge should be controlled and shared. On one side are institutions that believe knowledge is too dangerous to be freely available, that it needs to be carefully managed and controlled to prevent disruption and chaos. On the other side are communities and individuals who believe that knowledge belongs to all of humanity, that suppressing it is a form of theft from future generations. This battle is being fought in courtrooms where ownership of ancient manuscripts is disputed, in government agencies where classification decisions are made, in academic institutions where research funding is allocated, in traditional communities where elders decide whether to share their heritage with outsiders. But it's also being fought in less visible arenas, in encrypted chat rooms where researchers share forbidden discoveries, in secure networks where traditional communities coordinate preservation efforts, in anonymous publication platforms where suppressed knowledge slowly leaks into public view. The outcome of this battle will determine not just whether we recover the lost treasures of Alexandria, but how humanity approaches the relationship between knowledge and power in the digital age. Will we continue to treat advanced knowledge as a strategic resource to be hoarded by the powerful? Or will we develop new models for sharing knowledge that balance legitimate concerns about safety and stability with the right of all humans to benefit from our collective intellectual heritage? The stakes couldn't be higher. Climate change, resource depletion, technological disruption, and political instability are creating challenges that may require all of humanity's intellectual resources to address. If ancient texts really do contain knowledge that could help us address these challenges, then keeping that knowledge hidden may be more than just culturally destructive. It may be suicidal, but releasing powerful knowledge without appropriate safeguards could be equally dangerous. History is full of examples of technologies and ideas that were used for destructive purposes because they were developed faster than the wisdom to use them responsibly. This tension between the need for knowledge and the dangers of knowledge is at the heart of the Alexandria mystery. The ancient scholars who built the great library understood this tension. They created an institution that preserved and shared knowledge, while also maintaining careful control over who had access to what information. Perhaps that's the real lesson we need to learn from Alexandria. Not just how to find and preserve ancient knowledge, but how to create modern institutions that can handle powerful information responsibly. Institutions that can balance transparency with security, sharing with control, individual rights with collective safety. The traditional communities that have preserved Alexandrian manuscripts for over a millennium have developed sophisticated approaches to these challenges. They've maintained knowledge for generations while carefully controlling access to it. They've shared information within trusted networks while keeping it hidden from potentially hostile outsiders. They've balanced preservation with protection in ways that modern institutions are only beginning to understand. But their approaches were developed for a different world, a world of small communities, slow communication, and limited technological capabilities. The question is whether those approaches can be adapted to work in a globalized, digitized, rapidly changing modern world. Some traditional communities are experimenting with hybrid approaches that combine ancient wisdom with modern capabilities. Digital archives that use traditional protocols for access control, encrypted networks that allow secure communication across vast distances, collaborative research projects that respect traditional values while enabling rigorous scholarly investigation. These experiments are producing remarkable results, but they're also revealing new challenges. How do you maintain community control over knowledge when it's stored in digital formats that can be copied infinitely? How do you preserve cultural context when information is shared across radically different societies? How do you ensure that traditional values are respected when knowledge is used in modern contexts? These aren't just technical problems. They're philosophical challenges that go to the heart of what knowledge is and how it should be used. They require new forms of collaboration between traditional and modern knowledge systems, new approaches to ethics and responsibility, new institutions that can bridge different ways of understanding the world. The search for Alexandria's lost manuscripts is forcing us to confront these challenges, whether we're ready for them or not. Because the knowledge is still out there, still waiting to be discovered or revealed. And the decisions we make about how to handle that knowledge will shape the future of human civilization. We're standing at a crossroads that our ancestors could never have imagined. We have unprecedented capabilities for finding, preserving and sharing knowledge. But we also face unprecedented challenges in using that knowledge wisely. The choices we make in the coming years will determine whether the lost treasures of Alexandria become a blessing or a curse for future generations. The shadows are stirring, and the ancient wisdom is calling to us across the centuries. The question isn't just whether we can find it, it's whether we're wise enough to deserve it and brave enough to use it responsibly. Time will tell, but one thing is certain. The story of Alexandria's lost library is far from over. In fact, the most important chapters may be just beginning to be written. And we all have a role to play in determining how that story ends. The question of what happens next isn't just academic anymore. Because while we've been chasing shadows and fragments, something extraordinary has been quietly unfolding. Traditional communities that have guarded these secrets for generations are beginning to make contact, not just with individual researchers, but with each other. I first became aware of this when I noticed patterns in the encrypted messages I was receiving. References to coordinated meetings, mentions of the gathering and the Council of Keepers. Language that suggested something far more organized than isolated families protecting individual collections. Through carefully cultivated relationships, I learned about what insiders call the network, a loose confederation of traditional knowledge keepers that spans 3 continents. These aren't formal institutions with headquarters and organizational charts. They're organic connections between communities that have maintained Alexandrian materials for centuries, communities that are now beginning to coordinate their preservation and revelation efforts. The network operates according to principles that most modern institutions would find impossible to understand. Decisions aren't made by voting or executive decree, but through consensus-building processes that can take months or even years. Trust isn't established through contracts or legal agreements, but through generations of relationship building and mutual respect. But what makes the network particularly fascinating is its approach to knowledge sharing. They don't think in terms of publish or perish, of academic careers or intellectual property rights. They think in terms of readiness. When is the world ready for specific types of knowledge? When will revealing certain information do more good than harm? These assessments are based on sophisticated analyses of global conditions that would impress intelligence agencies. Network members monitor political stability, technological development, environmental conditions, social movements. They're tracking humanity's collective wisdom and maturity, trying to determine when we've evolved enough to handle the knowledge they've preserved. And according to several sources within the network, we may be approaching a threshold. Climate change, resource depletion, technological disruption, these challenges are pushing human civilization toward a crisis point where ancient wisdom might be not just helpful, but essential for survival. This has led to what some network members call the Great Revelation, a carefully coordinated effort to begin sharing selected materials with trusted researchers and institutions. Not all at once, not without safeguards, but systematically and strategically. I've seen evidence of this coordination in the form of manuscripts that are suddenly becoming available for study after being hidden for generations. Collections that are being digitized and shared within carefully controlled networks. Research collaborations that are producing results that would have been impossible just a few years ago. But the Great Revelation isn't just about sharing existing materials. It's also about revealing the existence of collections that most researchers never suspected existed. Hidden libraries in locations that have never been associated with manuscript preservation. Family collections that have been kept secret for so long that even their existence has been forgotten by the outside world. One network member, speaking through carefully arranged intermediaries, described the scope of what might be revealed. People think they understand the scale of what was preserved from Alexandria. They imagine a few scattered manuscripts, maybe some fragmentary texts. But the reality is far more extraordinary. Entire works by authors whose names have been lost to history. Complete scientific treatises that describe principles centuries ahead of their time. mathematical systems that could revolutionize modern computation. The challenge is managing the revelation process in ways that don't trigger the same suppression mechanisms that have operated for decades. Network members are acutely aware that powerful interests have worked to keep Alexandrian knowledge hidden, and they're developing strategies to circumvent those efforts. Part of this strategy involves distributing materials across multiple institutions simultaneously, making it impossible to suppress discoveries by controlling a single source. Another part involves releasing information through channels that are difficult to monitor or control. Anonymous publication platforms, encrypted networks, traditional media outlets in countries that are outside the influence of major powers. But perhaps most importantly, the network is building relationships with researchers and institutions that have demonstrated genuine commitment to responsible knowledge sharing. They're looking for partners who understand that ancient wisdom comes with responsibilities, not just opportunities. This selection process is incredibly rigorous. Potential collaborators are evaluated not just for their scholarly credentials, but for their ethical frameworks, their long-term commitments, their willingness to respect traditional values and concerns. The vetting process can take years, and many applicants are ultimately rejected. But those who do gain access to network materials are reporting discoveries that exceed their wildest expectations. Mathematical proofs that elegantly solve problems that have puzzled modern scholars for decades. Engineering principles that could transform renewable energy technology. Medical knowledge that suggests new approaches to treating diseases that current medicine struggles with. One researcher, bound by strict confidentiality agreements but willing to speak in general terms, described the experience. It's like suddenly having access to a parallel tradition of human knowledge that developed along completely different lines than what we know from the historical record. Not better necessarily, but different, with insights that complement and extend what we've figured out through modern science. But with these discoveries come new responsibilities and new dangers. Because knowledge that could revolutionize human civilization is also knowledge that could be weaponized, commercialized, or used to concentrate power in ways that could be deeply harmful. The network understands these dangers intimately. They've spent centuries thinking about the potential consequences of knowledge sharing, developing frameworks for evaluating risks and benefits that are far more sophisticated than what most modern institutions use. But they're also aware that the risks of continued secrecy may now outweigh the risks of revelation. Climate change is accelerating faster than most scientific models predicted. Political systems are becoming increasingly unstable. Resource conflicts are intensifying. The window for using ancient knowledge to address these challenges may be closing rapidly. This urgency is driving some network members to push for faster revelation than others are comfortable with. Internal debates are intensifying about how much to share, when to share it, and with whom. These aren't abstract academic discussions. They're life and death decisions about the future of human civilization. Some members argue that humanity has demonstrated enough wisdom and responsibility to handle advanced ancient knowledge. They point to international cooperation on challenges like disease control, space exploration, and environmental protection as evidence that we've evolved beyond the tribal conflicts that have characterized most of human history. Others remain deeply skeptical. They point to ongoing wars, environmental destruction, and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, as evidence that humanity isn't ready for knowledge that could be transformative or destructive depending on how it's used. But both sides agree on one thing. The status quo is unsustainable. The traditional approach of keeping ancient knowledge completely hidden is becoming impossible in a digitized, interconnected world. At the same time, the need for solutions to global challenges is becoming more urgent every year. This convergence of necessity and possibility is creating what some network members describe as a revelation cascade, a process where the release of some materials creates pressure to release others, where partial revelations generate demand for more complete information, where the boundaries between secret and public knowledge begin to blur and eventually dissolve. We may already be in the early stages of this cascade. The increasing number of researchers reporting access to previously unknown materials. The growing sophistication of techniques for finding and analyzing ancient texts. The breakdown of traditional barriers between different scholarly communities and knowledge systems. But cascades can be controlled or chaotic, gradual or sudden, beneficial or destructive. The difference often comes down to preparation, coordination, and wisdom in managing the process. This is where the network's centuries of experience in knowledge management becomes crucial. They've developed protocols for gradual revelation that could allow ancient wisdom to be integrated into modern society without causing disruptive shocks. They understand how to build trust between communities with very different values and perspectives. They know how to preserve cultural contexts while enabling cross-cultural collaboration. But implementing these protocols requires cooperation from modern institutions that may not be prepared for the kind of long-term, relationship-based approach that the network favors. Academic institutions focused on quick publication and career advancement. Government agencies concerned with immediate strategic advantages. Corporations interested in short-term profits. Bridging these different approaches to knowledge and time is one of the greatest challenges facing the revelation process. It requires creating new forms of collaboration that honor both traditional wisdom and modern capabilities, that balance transparency with security, that serve both individual interests and collective good. Some promising experiments are already underway. Research consortiums that include both traditional knowledge keepers and modern scholars. Digital preservation projects that respect cultural protocols while enabling wider access. Collaborative networks that share information within trusted communities while maintaining security against hostile actors. These experiments are producing remarkable results, but they're also revealing the complexity of the challenges involved. Cultural misunderstandings that can derail years of relationship building. Technical problems that threaten the security of sensitive information. Political pressures that can force premature revelation or continued suppression. But perhaps most challenging are the philosophical questions that arise when different knowledge systems encounter each other. What happens when ancient wisdom contradicts modern scientific understanding? How do you evaluate claims that can't be verified through conventional methods? How do you integrate spiritual or metaphysical insights into secular research frameworks? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're being worked out in real time through countless small interactions between traditional knowledge keepers and modern researchers. Each successful collaboration creates precedents and models that can be used in future projects. Each failure provides lessons about what doesn't work and why. The cumulative effect of these interactions is beginning to transform both traditional and modern approaches to knowledge. Traditional communities are experimenting with new technologies and methodologies while maintaining their core values. Modern institutions are developing more respectful and collaborative approaches to working with traditional knowledge systems. But the transformation is happening slowly, and time may be running short. The political instability that threatens traditional communities is intensifying. The environmental challenges that could benefit from ancient wisdom are accelerating. The technological capabilities that could enable new forms of collaboration are also creating new vulnerabilities and risks. This sense of urgency is driving some participants in the revelation process to take greater risks, to share more information more quickly than might be wise under normal circumstances. It's also attracting attention from actors who see opportunity in the chaos. Criminal organizations, hostile governments, unscrupulous corporations. The result is an increasingly complex and dangerous environment for anyone involved in the search for Alexandrian materials. Traditional communities find themselves caught between the need to preserve their knowledge and the pressure to share it. Researchers must navigate between legitimate scholarly interests and potentially exploitative commercial or political agendas. Institutions must balance transparency with security, openness with protection. But despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the search for Alexandria's lost library is entering its most dynamic and promising phase. Knowledge that has been hidden for over a millennium is beginning to emerge into the light. Relationships are being built between communities that have been isolated from each other for generations. New approaches to collaboration and knowledge sharing are being developed and tested. The question is no longer whether significant Alexandrian materials have survived. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is whether we can create the conditions necessary for that knowledge to be revealed and integrated into modern society in ways that maximize benefits while minimizing risks. That challenge requires more than just archaeological skill or scholarly expertise. It requires wisdom, patience, humility, and a deep commitment to serving the common good rather than narrow interests. It requires understanding that knowledge is not just information to be processed, but wisdom to be lived and applied responsibly. The ancient scholars who built Alexandria's library understood this distinction. They created an institution that was not just a repository of information, but a center of wisdom where knowledge was cultivated, refined, and applied for the benefit of human civilization. Their legacy challenges us to do the same, to create modern institutions and approaches that are worthy of the knowledge they preserve for us. We stand at a threshold that could determine the future of human knowledge. Behind us lie centuries of secrecy, suppression, and lost opportunities. Ahead lies the possibility of recovering wisdom that could help us address the greatest challenges our species has ever faced. The choice is ours, but we may not get another chance to make it. The shadows that have hidden Alexandria's treasures for so long are beginning to lift. The question is whether we're ready for what we might find in the light. The answer may be closer than we think. Because just 3 months ago, something extraordinary happened that nobody outside a very small circle knows about. A breakthrough that could change everything we think we know about Alexandria's lost treasures. Dr. Hassan Mahmoud was cataloguing routine acquisitions at the Egyptian National Library when he stumbled across something that shouldn't have existed. Tucked inside a collection donated by a family clearing out their grandfather's estate was a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be 18th century correspondence between European scholars. Nothing unusual there, except for one letter that made his hands tremble as he read it. The letter, written in 1798 by a member of Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, described in meticulous detail the discovery of a sealed chamber beneath a collapsed building in Alexandria. But this wasn't just any building, according to the writer's careful measurements and architectural descriptions. It was located precisely where historical sources suggested one of the library's satellite collections had been housed. More incredible still, the letter described the contents of that chamber. Hundreds of scroll cases, arranged in systematic rows, each labeled in both Greek and what the writer called the sacred script of the priests. The French scholar had managed to open several cases and found texts that he claimed were beyond the comprehension of modern learning. Mathematical treatises that used notation systems he'd never seen, astronomical calculations that seemed impossibly precise, even what appeared to be detailed anatomical drawings. But here's where the story gets truly astonishing. Instead of reporting this discovery to his superiors, the scholar made a fateful decision. Fearing that the materials would be shipped to France and lost to politics or warfare, he secretly moved the entire collection to what he described as a place of greater safety, known only to myself and one trusted Egyptian colleague. Dr. Mahmoud immediately recognized the implications. If this letter was genuine, and his preliminary analysis suggested it was, then a substantial collection of Alexandrian materials had been deliberately hidden by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Someone who understood their value and wanted to protect them from the chaos of empire and conquest. But the letter contained one more crucial detail, a hand-drawn map showing the location where the collection had been moved. The landmarks were clear enough that Dr. Mahmoud was able to identify the general area within hours. It was a site that had never been systematically excavated, located beneath what was now a busy residential neighborhood in modern Alexandria. Within weeks, Dr. Mahmoud had quietly assembled a small team of trusted colleagues and begun the delicate process of gaining permission for a limited excavation. Using ground-penetrating radar, they confirmed the presence of substantial underground structures in exactly the location indicated by the 200-year-old map. What they found defied every expectation. The chamber was exactly as the French scholar had described, a carefully constructed vault with stone shelving designed specifically for manuscript storage. The conditions were perfect for preservation: cool, dry, sealed from outside air and moisture. And the scrolls were still there, hundreds of them, in a state of preservation that made Dr. Mahmoud weep with joy. But as the team began the painstaking process of cataloguing and photographing the materials, they realized they were dealing with something unprecedented in the history of manuscript recovery. These weren't just any ancient texts. They were works that had been deliberately selected and preserved by someone who understood their extraordinary importance. Mathematical treatises that described computational methods centuries ahead of their supposed invention. Astronomical works that calculated planetary motions with precision that wouldn't be matched until the age of modern telescopes. Medical texts that included surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that seemed impossibly sophisticated for their era. One scroll contained what appeared to be a complete system of optics, including detailed instructions for grinding lenses and constructing magnification devices. Another described principles of hydraulics that could revolutionize modern water management systems. A third contained biological observations that demonstrated understanding of cellular structures that weren't supposed to be discovered until the invention of the microscope. Dr. Mahmoud knew immediately that they were looking at materials that could rewrite the entire history of human knowledge. But he also knew that revealing their discovery prematurely could be catastrophic. The political and commercial forces that had suppressed similar discoveries in the past were still active, still powerful. So the team made a decision that would have shocked the academic world. They chose secrecy. Instead of announcing their discovery, they began the careful process of studying and documenting the materials while keeping their existence completely hidden. They worked in shifts, often at night, using their own resources rather than seeking official funding that would have required disclosure. What they found over the following months exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The collection wasn't random. It had been curated by someone with extraordinary knowledge of what was truly important in Alexandria's holdings. These were the crown jewels, the most advanced and valuable texts from humanity's greatest library. But the team also found something else: evidence that they weren't the first modern scholars to discover these materials. Hidden among the ancient scrolls were more recent documents, notes written in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish, dating from different periods over the past several centuries. Each set of notes indicated that other scholars had found and studied these materials, then carefully resealed them for future generations. This discovery revealed something extraordinary about the preservation network we've been discussing. The collection hadn't just been sitting undisturbed for 2 centuries. It had been actively maintained by a succession of guardians who understood its value and took responsibility for its protection. The most recent notes, written in modern Arabic, were dated just 15 years ago. They included a detailed inventory of the collection and explicit instructions for future caretakers. These treasures belong not to any one person or nation, but to all humanity. Guard them well, share them wisely, and remember that knowledge without wisdom is the path to destruction. Dr. Mahmoud's team realized they had stumbled into something much larger than a single hidden collection. They had found evidence of an active, ongoing preservation network that had been protecting Alexandrian materials for generations. The same network that our investigation had been trying to understand. But now they faced an impossible decision. As scholars, they felt obligated to share their discovery with the world. But as guardians of irreplaceable knowledge, they understood the risks of premature revelation. They had seen what happened to researchers who got too close to these materials. They knew about the commercial and political forces that would seek to control or suppress their discovery. The solution they chose was both ingenious and dangerous. Instead of making a public announcement, they began carefully sharing selected materials with trusted researchers around the world. always with strict conditions about confidentiality and responsible use. They created a secure digital archive, encrypted and distributed across multiple servers, ensuring that the knowledge couldn't be lost even if the physical collection was discovered and seized. Most importantly, they reached out to the traditional preservation networks we've been discussing, letting them know that another cache of Alexandrian materials had been found and was being protected by scholars who understood their responsibilities as guardians, not just researchers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Traditional knowledge keepers from across the Mediterranean and Middle East began making contact, sharing information about their own collections, coordinating preservation efforts that spanned continents and generations. What Dr. Mahmoud had thought was a single remarkable discovery turned out to be the key that unlocked a treasure house of preserved knowledge that defied imagination. Collection after collection emerged from the shadows, not just individual manuscripts, but entire libraries that had been maintained in secret for over a millennium. The scope of what had been preserved was staggering. Complete works by authors whose names had been lost to history. Scientific treatises that described principles centuries ahead of their rediscovery. Mathematical systems that could revolutionize modern computation. Medical knowledge that suggested entirely new approaches to healing and human enhancement. But with revelation came danger. Word of the discoveries began to leak despite the team's careful security measures. The same forces that had suppressed previous findings began to mobilize. Government agencies started asking questions. Private collectors began making offers. Criminal organizations started paying attention. Dr. Mahmoud found himself at the center of a shadow war between those who wanted to control ancient knowledge and those who believed it belonged to all humanity. His team received threats, bribes, and ultimatums. Their excavation site was mysteriously flooded, forcing them to evacuate materials to multiple secure locations. The traditional knowledge keepers who had begun sharing their collections became targets as well. Communities that had maintained manuscripts for generations found themselves facing legal challenges, bureaucratic obstacles, and outright intimidation. The revelation cascade that some had hoped for was turning into a chaotic and dangerous scramble for control. But something unexpected happened in the midst of this chaos. Instead of retreating into secrecy as they had in the past, many traditional communities chose to accelerate their revelation efforts. If their knowledge was going to be exposed anyway, they reasoned, better to share it with trusted allies than to lose it to hostile forces. The result was an unprecedented surge in collaborative research between traditional knowledge keepers and modern scholars. Digital archives were created and shared across secure networks. Translation projects were launched to make ancient texts accessible to contemporary researchers. New institutions were founded to protect and study recovered materials. Dr. Mahmoud's discovery had triggered exactly what the traditional preservation networks had been preparing for. The great revelation that could either usher in a new age of human knowledge or destroy the careful balance that had kept ancient wisdom safe for so long. The outcome remains uncertain. Even now, as I'm recording this, the battle for control of Alexandria's legacy continues. Government agencies are declassifying materials they've kept hidden for decades. Private collectors are releasing manuscripts they've hoarded for generations. Traditional communities are making difficult decisions about how much of their heritage to reveal and to whom. But one thing is clear. The age of absolute secrecy is ending. Too much has been discovered, too many connections have been made, too many people now know the truth. Alexandria's lost library is finally emerging from the shadows. Not all at once, but piece by piece, collection by collection, revelation by revelation. The question that haunts me as we reach the end of this investigation is not whether we'll recover these ancient treasures. We already are. The question is whether we'll prove worthy of them, whether we'll use the knowledge they contain to build a better world, or whether we'll repeat the same patterns of conflict and suppression that have characterized so much of human history. The ancient scholars who built Alexandria's library believed that knowledge was humanity's greatest treasure, that wisdom was our highest achievement, that learning was the path to a better future. They risked everything to preserve that vision through the darkest periods of human history. Now, it's our turn. The knowledge they saved for us is finally within reach. The wisdom they preserved through centuries of darkness is beginning to see light again. The question is, what we'll do with the gift they've given us. We can treat these discoveries as commodities to be bought and sold, as weapons to be deployed for national advantage, as secrets to be hoarded by the powerful. Or we can honor the vision that created Alexandria in the first place, the dream of a world where knowledge belongs to all humanity, where wisdom is shared rather than hidden, where learning serves the common good rather than narrow interests. The choice is ours, and we're making it right now through every decision we make about how to handle these discoveries. Every researcher who chooses collaboration over competition, every institution that chooses openness over secrecy, every traditional community that chooses to share rather than hide their precious heritage. The lost Library of Alexandria was never really lost. It was scattered, hidden, protected by people who understood its value better than the civilizations that let it slip away. Now those scattered pieces are coming back together, not in a single building, but in a global network of scholars, communities, and institutions united by a common commitment to preserving and sharing human knowledge. This is the real Alexandria, not a place, but an idea, not a building, but a commitment to learning that transcends borders, cultures, and centuries. An idea that knowledge is too precious to be destroyed, too important to be hidden, too valuable to be controlled by any single group or interest. The Library of Alexandria is rising again, not from the ruins of ancient Egypt, but from the connections we're building between past and present, traditional and modern, secret and shared. The question isn't whether we can find it, we already have. The question is whether we can build it, whether we can create institutions and relationships worthy of the knowledge we've inherited. That's the real treasure hidden in Alexandria's legacy, not just the scrolls and texts and manuscripts, but the vision of what human civilization could become if we chose wisdom over ignorance, sharing over hoarding, cooperation over conflict. The shadows are lifting, the ancient knowledge is emerging, the choice is ours. What will we build with the gifts our ancestors preserved for us? What kind of future will we create with the wisdom they saved from the darkness? The answer depends on what we do next, on the decisions we make in the coming days, months, and years about how to honor the legacy of Alexandria while building something even greater for the generations that will come after us. The story of the lost Library of Alexandria is ending, but the story of what we'll do with what we've found is just beginning. And that story, our story, will determine whether the knowledge preserved through so much sacrifice and struggle will finally fulfill its promise to light the way toward a wiser, more enlightened future. The choice is ours, the time is now, and the greatest adventure in human learning is about to begin.